Welcome to the fourth in the Center for Free Expression series on threats to academic freedom. I'm Jim Turk, director of the center. Before I begin and introduce our panel, I'd like to acknowledge that the land in which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I'd also like to acknowledge the co-sponsors of today's panel. They are the Canadian Association of University Teachers, the American Association of University Professors, Penn Canada, and the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University. In previous sessions, we've explored academic freedom and the challenges faced by scholars of India, by scholars of Israel and Palestine, and today we're going to turn our attention to China. I'd like to introduce our panel. Our first panelist is Andrew Nathan. Andrew is class of 1999 professor of political science at Columbia University, whose teaching and research includes Chinese politics and foreign policy, and the comparative study of political participation and political culture, and of human rights. Andrew is a regular, he's an author he's an author and co-author and editor of a number of books on Chinese politics, and was a co-editor of the Tiananmen Papers. He is a regular reviewer on Asia and Pacific matters for foreign affairs, and a board member of human rights in China. He was formerly a member of the boards of the National Endowment for Democracy, Freedom House, and Human Rights Watch. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Joining Andrew is Meg Rithmire. Meg is F. Warren McFarland Associate Professor at Harvard Business School. Her teaching and research interests are comparative political economy of development, with a focus on China and Asia. Her latest book, I understand due out at the end of June, is titled The State and Capitalism in China. Meg is a faculty associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, and is on the editorial board of the China Quarterly. Welcome, Meg.
Thank you. Great to be here with you and Andy.
And the moderator for today's event is Henry Reichman. Henry is one of the leading authorities in North America on academic freedom. He's a former vice president of the American Association of University Professors. He was chair of the AAUP's Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure, and he's the author of a very important, relatively new book entitled Understanding Academic Freedom, which was published in 2021. Henry is a professor emeritus of history at California State University, East Bay. Welcome, Hank.
Welcome. Thank you, Jim.
The format for today's panel is going to be conversational. Hank is going to engage the panel in a discussion of a variety of issues related to the challenges faced by scholars of China. And then 45 minutes to an hour into the conversation, we're going to turn to the audience for any questions you may have. So if you have any questions that come to mind as you're listening to their conversation, please don't wait until we turn to the audience, but just write them down. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Just click on the Q&A button at any time, and you can just write whatever question you have for the panel. It could be for one or the other panelist or for the entire panel. And when we come to the point where the panel turns to the audience, Hank will ask Ange Holmes, the coordinator for the center, to read out the first question, and then they will answer that, and we'll turn and go through the questions that have come in. So please, we really encourage you to join the conversation by asking questions. That's all for me now, so I'll turn it back over to the three of you.
Thank you, Jim. It's really a pleasure to be here with these two esteemed and knowledgeable people about China. I'm particularly interested because back in what seems like another life in the 1970s, I was active in an organization which may still exist, I don't even know, called the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association. I went to China, where I actually ended up giving a talk at Fudan University to what I think was probably a very select group of party leaders. This was still during the Cultural Revolution. This is like returning home to an old interest of mine, but I've long lost touch with much of what's going on in China, so I'm eager to learn from our experts. So without further ado, let me begin by turning first to a discussion of some of the conditions for academic work in China itself, both for Chinese scholars and scholars from abroad studying in or visiting or teaching in China. It's my sense that a relative openness to dissenting scholarship and a limited academic freedom had emerged in the 2 decades after Mao's death, and to some extent survived the repressions that followed the Tiananmen events of 1989. But with the rise of Xi Jinping, pressures for ideological conformity have increased. I'm wondering, is that a more or less accurate impression? And if so, are pressures for conformity on scholars mainly based on a version of Maoist Marxist orthodoxy, or are they based more on ethnic nationalism? Andy, you want to take that first, and then?
Yeah, sure. When did you go to China, did you say, in the 1970s?
It was 1973, actually.
I see. So you were, lecturing to the, Meg, what was it called? The Revolutionary Committee, I think. So
I suspect, or even some smaller group.
And the professors sat in
I am not tremendously proud of the event, I have to tell you.
No, that's okay. But the old the professors sat in a ring in back, and the young military men who'd been seconded there to run the university sat in front and listened to you. And the professors were very humble, said that they were glad they had been sent down to live with the peasants to clean their thinking. So after Mao died, it's what you say is correct. The 1980s, the very late 70s and the 1980s up until Tiananmen were a period of considerable intellectual ferment, and people put out all kinds of adventurous new ideas and so forth. And the future path of China seemed to be up for debate. But 1989 crackdown put a stop to that. But after 1989, the discipline in academia was still relatively loose, seemingly because the leadership of the ruling Communist Party definitely wanted to control thinking, but they just were not very tough about it. So when Xi Jinping came in 2012, the sense I have is that he felt there was a crisis in party control of everything, of the bureaucracy, of corruption, of foreigners in the country, of culture, and so forth. And that extends to academia, so that there's been a tremendous tightening on academics, some of whom, so the average university, as far as I know, is tightly run by a party committee, by the party secretary, whose job it is to keep everybody in political line. Classrooms are videoed so that what people are teaching can be surveilled. Some students report on professors if the professors say something wrong. Liberal thinking has been pretty much wiped out. In our field, Meg's in my field of political, at least mine is poli-sci. I think, Meg, that you were also sort of trained in poli-sci, even though you're in a B school. I think a lot of the faculty are still interested in Western political science theories, and many of them are rather liberal in thinking, but for them to get a grant, which they need, or to publish, which they need in order to be promoted, they have to put Xi Jinping thinking, not Maoism, by the way. It's no longer Maoism. It's really Xi Jinping thinking in the, at the top of their grant proposal or of their article, and bury anything that's, let's say, objective scholarship someplace in the bottom 2/3 of the thing before a conclusion that then reaffirms Xi Jinping ideology. And just one more thing is that students in the colleges are required to study Chinese Marxism, which is mostly Xi Jinping thought. They don't actually read anything by Marx. My own sophomores at Columbia read Marx for 1 week, the manifesto, a selection of capital, selection from the economic and philosophic manuscripts. My students read more Marx than Chinese students who take a whole semester, actually 4 semesters, I believe, of study of what's called political thought, which is taught by special professors who are experts in that form of pedagogy.
That was fascinating. There's a bunch, I'm planning to visit China this summer and reconnect with colleagues. And although in the past few weeks, we've had a number of visitors, professors from Chinese universities who are, as China's opened up after the pandemic, who are visiting for the first time in several years. And it's been interesting to speak with them. I think that your question is a good one, whether it's classical kind of Marxist ideology or something new. And so, I echo Andy's impressions and his knowledge about what's going on Chinese campuses, that indeed that space for inquiry has narrowed a bit. It's not the first time that's happened in China. These things tend to go in waves, and we might consider whether this wave is a more lasting one than before. And so in terms of what Chinese scholars are able to do, this is for the most part, not their first experience with this. And so I have tremendous respect, actually, for the ways in which many of them have figured out how to navigate saying what they want to say a little less directly than normal. And so it takes some care and some clear nuance and reading of the nuances, I think, from American scholars in order to do that and to understand what people in China are indeed thinking right now. But what's really interesting, I think, about, as Andy says, it's not Mao Zedong thought or Marxist thought, it's Xi Jinping thought, right? And so we're seeing all sorts of presentations on everything with Chinese characteristics and Xi Jinping thought. And there are new institutes for the study of Xi Jinping thought. And I confess I'm not entirely sure exactly what it is. And I think most people in China, we knew relatively clearly what Mao Zedong thought kind of meant over time. And of course, we know, how it's been a while since I've read my Marx, actually, but I've read it, I've taught it. And we know what that looks like, but you don't see this kind of framing of everything in contemporary Chinese society in terms of, stages of communism and stages of revolution and, the proletariat. And despite, I think, Xi Jinping's emphasis on things like common prosperity and the disorderly expansion of capital, my primary message would be that the ideological content is a little less important right now than the actual discipline function that politics have and the repetition of the ideology has on campuses. And so it's less really about even common prosperity, I think, which is the signature slogan of Xi Jinping, is less about redistribution and communism and the return of red China, which is something you see all over the American media all the time. And it's really more about the form of discipline within Chinese society and the power that the party ought exercise. And they say that very clearly. The party should be at the center of all things. And so that means university classrooms. It also means firms. But I think it's less ideological and less about ideological content and conflict than it really is about state control over various functions in response to, I think, the CCP feeling like there are a bunch of influences within China and outside of China that are threatening to it. And so it's a response to a perceived threat rather than sort of some coming of age of ideological beliefs.
That to me sounds very similar in some ways. I'm actually was trained as a Russianist and did Russian and Soviet history, and sounds very similar to Putinism in some respects. But there's one aspect of Putinism has been, as it actually was of Stalinism even, has been an ethnic nationalism to it. It's very Russophilic, Russocentric. It's all about being Russian. I'm wondering, to what extent does Xi Jinping thought have this kind of Chinese nationalist element to it, and particularly ethnic? And I'm thinking in terms also of the role there of minority peoples in China. One thinks, of course, of the Uyghurs and that whole situation there. So,
yeah, Yeah, so Xi Jinping thought is very nationalistic in terms of we are rising, we are proud, we're going to be great. The West is rotten, similar to Putin's argument. The West is declining, but the West is aggressive and, as Meg said, threatening us. China has these 55 ethnic groups that are officially recognized, and the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Mongolians, and so forth are so-called ethnic minorities. The officially Chinese government ideology recognizes the ethnic minorities as having a right to their own culture, or cultures, I should say, but in practice, especially with the Uyghurs, what the government is apparently doing is trying to assimilate them, not to call them Han Chinese, but to make them lose their language, religion, culture, identity, to merge into a sort of civic Chinese identity of the state of the People's Republic of China. So I think anti-foreign nationalism and nationalism as a pride in our own strength and our own system is something that the government promulgates, and nobody is allowed to question that.
I would agree with that. I would agree that it's very much a nationalism, right? And not, and at least in the way in which it's framed, is not a race-based nationalism, but a kind of triumph of the Chinese system and a declaration of worthiness of the Chinese system. And so when you see, you know, modernization with Chinese characteristics, or capitalism with Chinese characteristics, socialism with kind of Chinese characteristics, what it really means is we, as China, as a different system, have a right to choose our own way of doing things. In practice, you know, the phrase in Chinese is something like Han chauvinism, right? In practice, it means this kind of focus on the traditional Han areas of Chinese culture. You know, there's a long history to how those 56 ethnic groups have been chosen and designated, right? And how they're managed hierarchically and represented within the party state itself. And the turn really in 2016 and Xinjiang was a dramatic one, and not one I would have predicted based on the China I had known for a couple of decades. I was surprised and disheartened, and to say the least, about what's happening in Xinjiang. And it seems pretty clear in terms of what's coming out of government documents that were leaked to the New York Times and other places, that it's a severe paranoid sense of threat on the part of the CCP, right? Of the idea of, you know, terrorism or splitism or secession desires, right? The fear of kind of color revolutions or the breakup of the Soviet Union befalling China in some way. And in that sense, then a tremendous overreaction. I mean, just a vast overreaction to the actual conditions within Uyghur society that has been really tragic. And a colleague of Andy and mine, Sheena Greitens at the University of Texas, has emphasized that fundamentally it won't work, that this kind of repression and this kind of effort to convert Uyghur citizens into not having, right, their own culture, their own religion, their own practices. And it doesn't work in the sense that you can't brainwash and imprison a population into submission in that way. And so I see it as a tragic and self-defeating turn, really, within politics in China, which, you know, 10 years ago, it was possible to visit Xinjiang and to travel there and to speak with Uyghurs. I myself have visited several times. I lived in Xinjiang for 6 months. And so the turn that society has taken has been a really dark part, I think, of this paranoia on the part of the CCP about its own monopoly on political power and its own longevity, and one that, I think is likely to be self-defeating.
I just want to emphasize, given our focus here on academic freedom, that part of that repression has been, you know, the silencing of Uyghur academics. Silencing is probably a mild word. Arrests, people who disappear for months, and their families eventually learn they're in a re-education camp somewhere. So it's really quite disturbing. One of the things that struck me in what I think Andy said it about the fact that all classes are recorded, and people are fearful of what they could say in class, etc. one of the projects I'm involved in now is the AAUP's Special Committee investigating developments in Florida. And of course, in Florida, they passed a law which allows students to surreptitiously, without instructors' permission, without their fellow students' permission, to record classes for the express purpose of challenging professors. So we're seeing a little bit of China here in Florida. But I want to go on to another question related to conditions in China before moving on to Chinese scholars of China here in the United States, which is, as a way of transitioning, is I know foreign scholars haven't been in China as much recently because of COVID. But when foreign scholars do visit China, and of course, Meg, you mentioned that you were there for 6 months in Xinjiang, do they have more or less academic freedom than the Chinese scholars? What kind of restrictions does one feel as an American or Canadian scholar in China?
I think Meg should take a first go at this.
Yeah, Andy has a much longer and more interesting story, I'm sure, than mine. You know, I'm younger. I'm younger than Andy, as you can tell. No, but I'm of a younger generation than Andy, and so in that sense, I'm really only now coming into the position where, for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been giving talks at Chinese universities and things like that. And I have always found that I can say almost anything I want in English. And I'm always encouraged to speak in English, even though I can deliver academics and have delivered academic talks in Chinese. But the reason why I'm encouraged to speak in English is because it's less likely for a recording of me saying something in English to go viral, simply because no one will understand it that well. And so, in that sense, I felt like I've been able, and of course the issues I work on I don't work on Xinjiang academically. I don't work on, the Tiananmen incident. I've not worked on these issues on Chinese borders, and that tend to be on this slate of hot button issues. Instead, I work on political economy, corruption, those kinds of things. And who knows whether those things have now been, and in fact, my colleagues and I have written about those things also being securitized, so viewed by the CCP as now integral to its own monopoly on political power. And so that space of hot button issues is widened, while the space for, you can say whatever you want about political economy, I believe that's probably narrowed, but we'll see what happens when I'm able to return. I think there's a way in which everyone's position is idiosyncratic in a way. And so there are certainly people who have been critical of aspects of the Chinese regime, or, done research on controversial aspects of Chinese politics forever. We're all mostly academics. And so our job is not to stand up and say, I condemn this and I condemn that, right? Most of us are doing social scientific work, some of which is difficult, but our fundamental task is not to take those constant normative positions, and we're not diplomats, right? And we're not there to condemn Chinese leaders for this and that. That's not my place. But for the most part, I've been able to do my research. I think there's a certain difference, and there are plenty of Chinese academics who can be much more vocal, or who 10 years ago who were able to be much more vocal about certain things and do more effective research about certain things because of their position. So different universities in China have different positions. Certain people within the Chinese press, as well as within academics, are more protected than others. And I've always admired their willingness to use that protection to say what they want to say and do research on the things that they want to do research on. I'm thinking of I won't name names, but a variety of scholars in China who have done pretty outstanding research on controversial topics because they know they're able to. And so, there are issues that we as foreign scholars have that Chinese scholars don't have, and then there are spaces that are wider. So, as you might not be surprised, given the way that I look, for me to tell you that I don't have family in China, so I don't have to worry about my family being repressed based on something I say or publish, which does give me a little more latitude to teach and publish about things that I want to write about. Whereas my colleagues of Chinese descent who have family back in China have a different set of issues. And so some of our colleagues in the field have done some research on what they call relational repression. So Kevin O'Brien and Lilian Zhang's work, whereby the party state tends to use relationships with family members in order to try to silence people or to hold them accountable for what they say. So I don't face those issues. And so I feel in that sense that I have a particular burden. Sorry, my children are in the office here with me. And so sorry if I seem distracted. If I have a particular burden, right, that tend to then take my space to do the things I can do. What I can't do right now, I'm fairly confident, is the kind of grassroots level field work that I was able to do in that period of flourishing, Hank, that you mentioned, right? Especially the early 2000s. My dissertation was based on archival research and archives that my Chinese colleagues can no longer access. And so, and to do field work, to show up at factories or to show up at government offices, those are things I'm not able to do anymore, but some of my Chinese graduate students are able to do those things. And so I think what we depend on going forward to learn as much as we can about Chinese society, which we should continue to do, right, no matter what it looks like, is those kinds of partnerships and being attentive to the nuances and the fact that different people's biographies are going to allow them to do different kinds of work. And we may not like that, but if our goal is to learn as much as we want to learn about China, then I think that's something we have to embrace in the coming years.
My Chinese grad students found post-COVID that even on Chinese people, these are grad students in poli-sci at Columbia who are Chinese citizens, have found that people are afraid to talk to them even about what would seem to be relatively sort of technical topics, because nobody knows what's safe to talk about to somebody in that position, that is somebody who's doing a PhD at a foreign university. And then what Meg was alluding to about my interesting history is the history of being banned. So I can't get a visa to go to China to do research. And a lot of people don't know whether they can get a visa. Some definitely haven't been able to. Some are worried that they may not be able to. So this is a constraint. So I'm glad to hear that Meg has had experiences of going there recently and being able to do.
Not quite yet. So I'm hoping to go this summer. I haven't been since January 2020, so not quite yet, but I'm quite hopeful.
But even in the Xi Jinping era before COVID,
absolutely,
you were able to do some actual research there.
Yeah.
And I hope that will be true. But and as she said, every experience is individual. But my sense of it is that right now, it's very hard to find a topic that anybody will feel safe talking about, except when the Chinese grad student has personal connections that which make them feel safe and make us as their advisors feel relatively hopeful that they're going to be safe themselves and that their subjects whom they interview will be safe, because all of those things, the safety of our student, the safety of their interview subjects, those are all considerations for us.
So let's turn now to the situation for those who study China abroad, particularly in the US, but also in Canada, and the situation of scholars not only who study China, but who study anything, engineering, whatever, but who are ethnically Chinese, whether they are US or Canadian citizens or have green cards or what have you. Yesterday, the Times Higher Education carried a piece about the status of the now formally defunct China initiative undertaken by the Trump administration, which, as you well know, of course, and many in the audience probably do too, that resulted in the arrests of dozens of researchers. That piece cautioned that conditions have not fundamentally changed. Let me read a sentence or two from it. It says, the underlying political sentiment that drove the Trump administration effort, which started in November 2018, still alarms many in academia who regard the alleged violations behind dozens of researcher arrests as relatively minor compared with the significant risks of over-enforcement, and who do not see the government under President Biden clearly understanding that. I'm wondering what you think of that. Is the China initiative alive and well at some level? And how concerning should that be for American academics and our how much we value academic freedom?
I'll start, I guess, if that's okay, Andy.
Please.
So, I think it's interesting, the section you read, that, the sentiment hasn't necessarily changed, but actually the institutions matter quite a bit. So as a long reader of Andy's work, I can tell you the institutions matter quite a bit. And the fact is that the sentiment is there, but what the China initiative did, right, was institutionalize that, such that the FBI, and I've learned so much from Maggie Lewis at Seton Hall on this, and so I would point to her work. I have not done scholarship on this, but she's a law professor who's done a lot of work on this. And what the China initiative did was, create FBI field offices in different places that were focused on bringing cases on China. And of course, once you create those incentives in those offices, you're going to get people to meet those expectations. And so there was a dozen or so suits brought and criminal charges filed, none of which, only one case actually resulted in any kind of actual indictment and charges that were sustained over time. And so if the sentiment is still there, I would still prefer, right, not to have it institutionalized in a way that we have FBI agents searching, right, for evidence of Chinese influence and nefarious relationships between Chinese researchers and academic researchers that they inevitably find, whether there's a real there or not. And Maggie Lewis herself says there is, as she says, there is a there in the sense that, it's not worth denying that there's no effort. I mean, the Thousand Talents program is real, right? Efforts to kind of Chinese corporate espionage is real. There are occasionally, right, Chinese Communist Party members or, members of the PLA who are dispatched to American campuses for things. I think what I would like people to recognize is how ham-handed, right, some of those efforts really are, right? And so, I mean, when you look into who they're sending and under what conditions, right, it's not, to put it kind of in a vernacular, it's not the best and the brightest of like the Chinese scientists that they're sending over to get secrets. And, even when, and you've had, some great reporting lately on how this has worked in terms of corporate espionage and others. And it's not always, right, these efforts that are really yielding a lot of results for China. And so, as open societies, right, we have to ask ourselves, right, what is worth it, right? So I would point to this paper that came out, some researchers at University of California, San Diego, led by Margaret Roberts is her formal name, that have found, a chilling effect of the FBI's China initiative efforts on collaboration between US and Chinese scientists. And, some people with the mindset that, everything China does is nefarious and they're going to steal all of our secrets might say, great, that's exactly what we wanted to chill. But actually the vast majority of those collaborations are on basic science, on public health, on clean technology, climate abatement kind of issues, as well as basic things like curing cancer. And so as an open society, how much are we understanding that threat and perceiving that threat? And so that's where the sentiment matters. If the sentiment is China is incredibly organized and there's an organized effort to constantly steal American secrets through universities and firms, then I think we're at risk for overreacting as a society and changing some of our institutions in a way that does involve racial profiling, right? Does involve, cutting off what's best, basically about how American universities and our open science model actually work. And so the sentiment has changed or stayed the same, but the institutions have changed. I welcome the institutional change, but I'm concerned about the sentiments. I'm concerned.
There's reason to be concerned also because some of this predate the China initiative and the Obama administration. I remember the case of Xiaoxing Xi, a Temple University physicist who was arrested at gunpoint by the FBI in his home, middle of the night. His teenage daughters and his wife pushed up against the wall, all that, they charged him with espionage, with selling to the Chinese something, a physicist understand it's something called a pocket heater, until, his lawyer got other physicists to show to the government that in fact, this was not a pocket heater, that the FBI agent just made it up. She eventually sued. I don't know what the status of that suit is right now. I became involved in this through the AAUP, and we actually issued a position paper on these things. And I think the point Meg was making is what we were making is yes, espionage is a real threat, but how do you fight it? Do you fight it by turning ourselves into a closed society?
Right. And it's not, I mean, just to be clear, I've actually met, I'm not sure if I should say this, I've met with the FBI many times, right? Because part of what they were doing is the China Initiative is having these meetings with local professors to say, hey, look, we're not all bad guys. We're not all out to get China here. And it's not that I think that they're all, evil actors, right? They're responding to their own bureaucratic incentives and they're doing their best, right? But should we have law enforcement agents Google translating things, that basic scientists are, corresponding about? I mean, it takes a high level, as you know, Hank, a high level of expertise to determine whether something's a proprietary piece of technology, funded through something, or whether it's basic science. And so that also should be part of our open model. And so it's not that the FBI was like, evil or something. They were responding to the sense of threat that they had, but some proportion, I think, would be welcome in thinking about how we respond to those.
The FBI needs more real China expertise as well. They need to go to school with us, because it is hard. It is hard to distinguish, because the Chinese government has a policy that says that all ethnic Chinese, all sons and daughters of the Yellow Emperor, must be loyal to the motherland, and that's irrespective of what your citizenship is. And then they have programs, Meg alluded to the 1,000 Talents program and various programs that they try to bring back distinguished scientists to form companies or to teach in China and so on. So, the loss of intellectual property has been a real thing. The spying by some Chinese entities on campuses and so forth has been a real thing. But the FBI, and of course, racial profiling is wrong, but the fact is that most people spying for China are ethnic Chinese, because not all, because they speak the language and have the feelings of loyalty to the country and stuff like that. But the thing is, the FBI needs to get it right and not to indict people who in fact are innocent.
Right. And it's difficult. I think we as China scholars are in a difficult place, because I remember when a colleague of mine said, well, we should do like an educational program for the FBI, to teach them about how China works so they understand how ham-fisted some of these things are. And I said, well, then if I'm working with the US intelligence agencies, does that compromise me in China in some way, even though what I might be doing, right, is not, of course, informing on what's going on in China. I have no information that would be useful, but I think it's a delicate balance, because we as scholars want our governments to understand more, but then we don't want to be seen, right, as speaking with intelligence agencies also. And so it's a difficult spot.
Yeah, a few years ago, we might have talked also here about the Confucius Institutes. In fact, when I was chair of AAUP's Committee A back in, I think it was 2017 or maybe even earlier, no, 2015, I can't remember exactly what year, we issued a statement about concerns we had about the Confucius Institutes and the threat to academic freedom from China, and of course now the Confucius Institutes are all but defunct. And I would argue for all the wrong reasons. A fear of Chinese espionage, which was never proven. The Confucius Institutes were not a source of that, but not the real concerns that we had, which was that they were institutions on American university campuses completely immune from our principles and the policies around academic freedom, both for the American students of whatever ethnicity might have studied there, but also for all the faculty who came over from China, and often, subject to the approval of party authorities, etc. Speaking of that, I'm wondering about the role of the very many Chinese students who are now studying at US and Canadian universities. Just last month, we learned of the arrests of Chinese nationals in New York who had allegedly set up a Chinese police station in that city to spy on and harass Chinese dissidents and other Chinese citizens, and perhaps American citizens of Chinese descent. So in the context of I mean, that's a pretty shocking story, but in the broader context, how much academic freedom do Chinese students abroad have? And of course, Andrew, you've been mentioning that you have students who are Chinese graduate students. I suspect Meg does also. I'm wondering how much academic freedom do they have, and what should American professors, especially American professors who are not China experts, know about teaching Chinese students from abroad? I know where I taught, it's not Harvard or Columbia. We didn't have graduate students. We did have a good number of Chinese students. I will say they were not the academic elite. And there were real questions of how we taught them. What were their, by the way, most of them, their English was unbelievably poor, but that was another issue. So I'll leave it at that. I won't go into that story. We were just, our administration was just trying to get the foreign student and, the out-of-state tuition. They didn't really much care what happened, but that's another story.
I'll pick up first. So the arrest of these sort of police agents in New York really has nothing to do with the campus, I think. There's an NGO called Safeguard Defenders, which has exposed the fact that there are, I forget the number, but something like over 100 of these sort of police outposts in various countries around the world, including Canada and the United States, that whose main job, as you said, is to deal with dissidents and fugitives. There are a lot of, I don't know how many, but there are a number of Chinese, fugitives from Chinese justice who are overseas, especially from corruption cases. And so these police stations have been set up to try to pressure them to go home, and without permission of the host government. So it's kind of slow for the United States to begin to arrest some of these guys, but that's what that's about. It's not really about the campus. On campus, my own experience, and I've heard different things from colleagues at other institutions, well, we should also say most of the Chinese students on, I suppose most campuses, certainly at Columbia, are in engineering, they're in science, they're in financial engineering, they're in statistics, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that in terms of their studies, they experience any, lack of academic freedom, because those subjects are not political. But my students are in poli-sci, or my undergraduate Chinese students in various, liberal arts majors. I have not noticed or experienced anxiety on their part about what they say in class, or about coming to me in office hours and asking all kinds of questions, even in together with somebody else. I don't know why that is, whether it's some kind of self-selection of students who come to me or not. The other day, one of my Chinese students said that there's a club on the Columbia campus of Chinese students who are collecting information on which Chinese student is taking whose course, like who is in Andy Nathan's course, to send back to the consulate. I don't know if that's true. I just heard it from this one person. I don't really know what the consulate can make out of that information. Of course, agencies like that like to have all the information they can and triangulate, so maybe that information is worth something. But I haven't noticed the anxiety on the part of the students. So then there's also an organization called the Chinese Students and Scholars Association on most American campuses, and I've never been very clear what it does. It's pretty clear that it has a relationship with the Chinese consulate. The consulate supports some harmless activities, China New Year's celebration and stuff like that. And what the consulate gets in return, I don't know.
I share Andy's observation that my students are not nervous to talk about their country. Basically, they seem. I mean, I think there's a couple of different things. I think American universities, I assume Canadian universities, although I've only taught at an American university, are open places, right? Where we want inquiry and debate. And in particular, I teach at the Harvard Business School, right? Where we have the case method. And what that really means for me is I teach Socratically. So I teach through questions and I cold call students. And I know China, so I know that the best class for me is not to be had by cold calling a Chinese student in the first 5 minutes of a class on something sensitive in China, not because I'm protecting that student from something, but because that's a antagonistic move that doesn't really invite the student to say something that's subtle, right? So I mean, there's good and bad pedagogy, and it's the same whether things are bad in China or good in China. And so it's our job, right, as faculty members, not to make everyone feel comfortable all the time. That is not what I'm here for. I'm here to challenge people and help them learn, but in ways that are effective rather than ineffective. And so the interesting kind of trend has been, of course, China is so important to everything, right? So, colleagues teaching in finance, teaching in dance, literature, everyone has a China part of general classes that they teach now. It's no longer confined to just the China specialists. And that is fantastic, right? It's all hands on deck. It's great. We have a bunch of different people wanting to understand China. In 2020, some colleagues and I wrote something which I think was published in China File eventually on China's new national security law. So China's national security law in 2020, passed after the turmoil in Hong Kong, basically is vague, like many Chinese laws, and it appears to apply extraterritorially, saying basically it's a criminal offense to speak about China in ways that threaten the CCP's monopoly on political power. So meaning it's, to question the status of Hong Kong or Taiwan or various things is now kind of illegal in China. Frankly, we do not know how that's going to be enforced. We know how it's being enforced in Hong Kong a little bit, right? We've seen arrests of journalists and things like that. And in fact, some ramifications for university professors in Hong Kong, although the specifics of that are hard to understand, but there have been various enforcement mechanisms of that law in Hong Kong. But in terms of how it works in mainland China, or how it might apply to those of us outside of China, we don't know, right? Especially Chinese nationals outside of China. So in 2020, our context for writing that was, we're all teaching on Zoom. Some of us are teaching students who are physically in China, very much in the jurisdiction of the PRC. And, if I have colleagues who are cold calling students in China and asking them, what do you think about Taiwan? You might be actually compelling a Chinese citizen to violate the law of China and endanger herself, right, by doing that. And so, it doesn't mean we should refrain from discussing those things, but we should understand, right, those sensitivities that Chinese students may have. And it's just not my belief that the best pedagogy is to, put people in the spot. In terms of how the Chinese students seem to work on campus, there's a lot of consternation about whether there's censorship or self-censorship or monitoring and things like that. It's not my view that that's happening as much as people are afraid that it's happening. Instead, what I found, at least among my MBA students, is, I have many from China. And when we discuss China in class, they have debates among themselves about how they should talk about China. And actually, and my American students will say, oh, they all meet beforehand and they have these debates about what they should say about China. And I said, and if you were the only 5 Americans in a class in France that was studying, American democracy, would you have debates among yourself about what you should say and not say about America? Because I think that sounds like a reasonable thing for a group of students to do, right? As long as it's open, people can feel individually open to expressing themselves. And the best thing that we can do as university professors is create that environment in a way that neither antagonizes nor overly coddles the students. And so the tactics have to be clear. The Chinese Scholars and Students Associations, I also feel like, there was this, I referenced to both of you before we started the session, there was a report from the Hoover Institute in Stanford, right, that was about this influence on campus that, I thought made a big deal out of some of these things. But, I can't really speak that much about it. But we've had these kinds of incidents at things in different places, and I won't tell anecdotes about other universities. That's not fair since I'm not privy to what they're doing. But most of it again is pretty silly, right? As Andy's saying, like, collecting this information, what are you going to do with it? We don't know. But a lot of the efforts of the Chinese Scholars and Students Association to, oh, we should try to get this event canceled or that event canceled, they mostly fail at doing that. And so my message is always just that, yeah, these things exist. If various universities want to say, this is an organization that, because it's sponsored by a foreign consulate, it doesn't get access to renting rooms on campus and get campus approval of hosting events, that's fine. But in order to go after it, or proactively think of it as like a threat to American national security, I think would be an overreaction. For the most part, we should trust our open environment to be able to suss out what are bad ideas and sponsored ideas, and what are good ones that people actually like to hear about and learn from.
I want to make 2 points. One is that just to supplement what Meg said about the national security law in Hong Kong, it explicitly has extraterritorial effect. They could indict me under that law, for example.
And me. Yeah, sure. And me, and almost any of us who've talked about.
Or anybody. But I'm not aware that has happened.
Same.
Secondly, although maybe the Hong Kong activist whose name Sam Chu, has he been indicted under the NSL? So there are no, the Hong Kong diaspora has formed several different organizations to lobby in Washington and elsewhere against the crackdown in Hong Kong, and Sam Chu is one of these guys, and I think maybe he was indicted or some legal thing was done against him under the NSL. The second thing I wanted to bring up, Meg, you probably remember more clearly than I do the arrangements that our colleague Rory Truex at Princeton made to protect his Chinese students. Was it because of Zoom classes in COVID or something like that? And so he was did everything he could to preserve the anonymity of the Chinese students, like when they submitted papers, how did he do it? I can't remember now, but he was concerned about providing anonymity so that his Chinese students would feel safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's an example of things that, that it was interesting because that was picked up by the American press on the left and the right as, oh, they're coddling, the students now, is what the right wants to say. And, the left was like, oh, American professors are, making it easy for China. You just can't get anything right. But I think that is kind of an example of, continuing to teach the material we teach while not taking unnecessary steps, right, to endanger the students. And I don't know, Roy would have to speak for himself. I don't know if he ended up implementing all of those things and how all that worked. My message was just try not to cold call students in China about explicitly controversial things. Also, it's bad pedagogy. So don't do it in general.
I just want to applaud you, Meg, for what you just said about this thing, making it's a question of good or bad pedagogy. And there are so many cases, not just about China. Having done this academic freedom work for the past decade, where there are so many issues where it becomes a matter of disciplining a professor or a student, or a behavioral question, where it really is a question of what's effective teaching. And effective teaching it varies from as we all know, different people have different teaching styles, different ways of doing things, etc. Exposing students to a variety of it is part of the education. But, that some of these questions are pedagogical questions, and that doesn't make them easy questions, but they're not questions of, right or wrong, politically correct or not, or, basic academic freedom conflicts. They're about how do we teach more effectively given who our students are and who we are.
Right.
Hank, you may probably remember, as I do, that back in the day, the South Korean military government and the Taiwan authoritarian government both had very evident spy operations on campuses, which scared those students. But one thing is pedagogy, but the other thing is that our universities are really unable to protect that we just don't have the capability to protect our students if they are
Right.
exposed to this kind of risk. We don't have, we have university police, but they're not, they're just guards on the physical campus. I mean, we don't have the ability to crack down on that kind of activity when it used to take place. And if it's taking place now, we don't know what to do about it. We don't really know. We haven't investigated it, and we don't know what's happening.
Right.
Yeah. Also, speaking of Rory, he and Sheena, whom you mentioned, and was there somebody else?
No, it's just the two of them. Yeah, that paper,
They
right.
did a survey of American China specialists about whether they've been denied a visa, whether they have self-censored because of fear of being denied a visa, whether they have advised their students to censor themselves out of fear for either the student not getting a visa or impact on the student's future career, or in the case of Chinese students, the family linkage and stuff like that. And they found, as I remember, Meg, a single-digit percentage, right, of scholars who said, yes, I have self-censored.
Very low.
It can partly be due to what Meg said, is that the topics that we're predominantly researching are sort of technical in a way. They're not directly attacking the Chinese communist system. If there's a criticism in it, it's sort of
nuanced and subversive and kind of buried. Yeah, exactly. Not because we're afraid, but because that's not our project intellectually.
Yeah.
Well, I know back when I was a graduate student in the 1970s in Russian Soviet studies, I mean, it was clear that there were certain topics that you just wouldn't study about Soviet history because you couldn't. Because if you wanted to study them, you wouldn't get into any relevant archives, and so people were naturally steered to things that would be less controversial with Soviet authorities. And of course, once the Soviet Union collapsed, that changed dramatically. Of course, now the situation changed once again, but that's another story. So it is, certainly credible to think that scholars of China in the West would, not out of self-censorship or anything else, would just take up topics that they're able to research as opposed to things that they can't.
Another interesting wrinkle here, if you look at in the pages of a journal like the Journal of Contemporary China, there are many, many, many articles written by Chinese people some of them are in China, some are in Hong Kong, Macau, some are outside, that are very, what should I say, very truthful and accurate. They're not predominantly polemical at all, but they do expose problems, issues, and so on and so forth. And I think part of the mechanism there is that Chinese academics in China get a lot of extra points in their promotion, tenure, and stuff like that from publishing in English, but that the Chinese security people don't basically care what is published in English, just that it's in English in a certain journal with a certain rank. So they do that. They're incentivized by this Chinese system today to do that. Meg, do you see that too?
Yes, and that's changing all the time. And in fact, there's, I think, some really interesting scholarship right now being done on the history of higher education in China and how it's changing over time. And so how those metrics change, right? Because, it used to be that actually 15 years ago, everyone was incentivized to publish in top level English journals. And those were the points for promotion and for raises and things like that. And now they want to make Chinese journals, the best journals in the world. And so now if you're publishing in, American social science journals, that's like the wrong thing to do. And so it's a constantly moving target. But But Hank, I think what you said is so right, right? Is it self-censorship, or is it, whether I'm doing scholarship that's feasible, right? It's not that I'm, people I remember when I was in graduate school, people would say, oh, you China people never work on the hard issues, you never work on the one-child policy, and you never work on this or that, and I said, look, China is a huge society. There's a lot we don't know. I don't run around telling my American politics colleagues, like, you must, if you're not studying racial inequality, then you're not doing the real stuff, right? Like, I think there's a lot of questions that we have to answer, and there's room for everyone. But then also,
So-
certain things, I mean, I'm a social scientist with standards of evidence, and I'm not going to meet my own standards by studying things I can't actually study. And so it's not self-censorship or somehow pulling punches. Yeah.
All right, Meg, I'm going to interrupt because I know you have to leave soon, and we do have some
do.
questions in the Q&A.
Great.
So I want to ask Ange if you could turn now to some of the questions we've had from people in the audience.
Yeah, so the first question, I do want to remind people in the audience that you can use the Q&A button to ask a question. So just use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of the screen. The first question is from Chris, and Chris says, I'm not sure if any on the panel are aware of challenges being faced by scholars of India who write about the current Modi government's efforts to transform India from a multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy into a Hindu nationalist state. They often face direct threats from the Indian government as well as from organized elements of the Indian diaspora in Canada, US, and Europe. Are things similar or different for scholars of China?
Repeat the beginning of that question for me, because I was thinking this is an India question. So who is pressuring whom, according to that question?
The challenges being faced by scholars of India who write about the current Modi government's efforts to transform India, and that they're facing direct threats from the Indian government as well as from organized elements of the Indian diaspora in Canada, US, and Europe. So just wondering if things are similar for scholars.
I don't, not to my knowledge. Well, we've already mentioned, pressure from the Chinese government in the sense of visa denials, which are, don't affect everybody, but they sort of send a message to everybody. But I myself have not heard. Well, I have a sort of a long story. I published in 2001 a book I co-edited called the Tiananmen Papers, which the Chinese government absolutely hated. And subsequently, twice, I guess, a Chinese scholar who I believe was a security officer under cover of scholarship told me that if I would just recant, apologize, and admit that I had been wrong, I would be able to go back to China, which is really not what this questioner is describing. And it hasn't happened in many, many years, maybe because they think I'm a lost cause. And the Chinese community in the United States, which is fairly diverse, no, I've heard nothing from them other than my own friends who are in the dissident community who are supportive. Nor have I heard of any other colleague of mine in the China studies community experiencing things like what that questioner asked. But Meg, have you heard other things?
I think it's a great question, and unfortunately I'm going to have to go after I put my 2 cents in and leave it to the two of you to take over. I apologize. I have to do my mom duties, and so I'm not in the stage of life where I can abandon my child. So I'll have to go. But I just want to say one thing. No, Andy, I'm not aware of anything like that. And I think the interesting difference, right, between India and China is that, in a sense, right, the kind of right-wing Hindu nationalists contingent, right, of citizens within India and in the diaspora are free to do whatever they want to do. Whereas I don't think that kind of group within China is free to do whatever it wants to do. So it's not as if Xi Jinping has given free rein to every ethnic Chinese nationalist who wants to, pressure Andy or say things to some other people and dissidents, all around. I echo Andy's reflection that the Chinese diaspora, I mean, within China, the Chinese population itself is also extraordinarily diverse. And within, the Chinese diaspora is quite diverse. And none of that has gone away just because it's not so easy to express anymore. But this kind of dynamic whereby Modi seems to have been given license to a much more extreme group of people than to go out and do this bidding. That dynamic hasn't happened in China because the Chinese internet is incredibly censored, right? And it's not as if these people have been empowered to go and internationalize in that particular way. And so China's just a much more closed society right now. And so that kind of thing hasn't happened. To my knowledge, I'm just not aware of things like that. But I do apologize for having to leave, but it was so terrific to speak to both of you. And I wish I could stay for a few minutes. I apologize.
We understand, Meg. Thank you very much for your participation. It was really
All right.
very interesting and very helpful.
Okay, thank you. Nice to be here.
So, Ange, I believe we have another question.
Yeah, the next question is from Lionel, and Lionel asks, would you be able to distill positive elements in Xi Jinping thinking, and what would be the negative features?
I'll pick up from a point made both by Meg and myself, which is that I think Xi Jinping's ideology is based on an idea that China is under threat. China is strong, China is rising, but it is under threat. And therefore, it needs to defend itself, and it needs to pull together in order to defend itself. So this requires discipline, unity on the part of every member, 100 million approximately member of the ruling Chinese Communist Party, as well as on the part of the citizens. The entrepreneurs also need to keep in mind the national interest and be dominant, do what the state tells them to do and things of that kind. So it's a message of national unity. The three confidences that the Communist Party, as Meg said, needs to control things north, south, east, west. That disciplinary component, and is that negative or positive? It depends on your point of view. From the point of view of free speech, it's negative. Then there is the idea that the international system ought to be more democratic or multipolar, meaning the Americans and their allies should not be able to dominate and say, we have a rules-based system, and the rules we're talking about are our rules that we created and which we constantly reinterpret. So that sounds progressive, because it's true that the United States has conducted, always like every other big state, a kind of cynical foreign policy in its own interest. But in the Chinese case, they're not doing it for idealistic reasons either, but because they're trying to push back against the United States. His idea that international politics is a community of common fate sounds really, really good, because it's true. Under climate change and other global threats, we are in a community of common fate. On the other hand, what that operationally means for China is that China has a model that should be respected, and its influence should be accepted around the world, which it has money to back up with the thing called the Belt and Road Initiative. You see in Ukraine that China has put out a 12-point peace proposal, of which the first, I think, 4 points are kind of the Americans caused this, and the Americans should get out, and the Americans should stop adding fuel to the fire by sending weapons. And then there's a point about the thing should be settled through peaceful talks, which of course makes a lot of sense, because it will only ever be settled by peaceful talks, but at the same time overlooks or denies the fact that one side of this battle is an aggressor violating the UN principle of territorial integrity. And then it has an article that says a nuclear war cannot be fought, should not be fought, and cannot be won, which is very useful item in this 12-point declaration because it sort of deprives Putin. If China won't allow Putin to, if Putin's use of nuclear weapons would offend China, it means that Putin basically cannot use nuclear weapons, and his ability to plausibly threaten or credibly threaten that use, and by doing so to scare the West from not providing equipment, stuff like that, is tremendously diminished. So that is a good part of that declaration. So these are some of the key points of Xi Jinping's ideology, domestic and international, which are skillfully drafted and sound good, and in some parts I think really are good, but don't depart from the great power principle that one's own national interest is behind everything that one says, and which is true of the United States as well.
Anne, should we have another question?
I do have one more from Mara. Mara asks, some have suggested that the West's foreign policy to China is increasingly coming to resemble the hard Cold War policy toward the Soviet Union starting in the 1940s. Do you see similarities? And if so, what do you think will be the implications for North American-based scholars of China?
This is the posture of the West toward China was the question, right? Is resembling the Cold War? Yes. I mean, I think that it does. There are differences that are important, but the similarities I think are more and more important. So among the differences are that the Soviet Union ostensibly it articulated a universal ideology. It said that the whole world must become, communist sooner or later. Not that it ever had any serious chance of doing that. And it supported ideologically communist movements, parties, and armed movements in a number of places. The Chinese are not saying, despite what is said by many China threat theorists in the United States, that China's going to take over the world and China's going to, ruin Western civilization and so on. The Chinese have not articulated an ambition to spread their model of government to the entire world. Like I was saying before, that they say the world should be multipolar, and they also adhere to cultural relativism, that every culture is equally valuable and every country should choose its own form of government and stuff like that. So it's not a globe-spanning ideological confrontation yet, and I don't think it will be, but certainly not yet. Then the fact that the Soviet Union confronted the Western alliance on the land mass of Europe made it likely that a war between the two sides would be a land war, and a land war would be very protracted and huge. The US-China war, if it happens, will also be a terrible, terrible thing, but it'll be basically a sea war, across the Taiwan Strait and in the South China Sea, which is potentially, it all depends on how it goes, potentially shorter and more quickly decided one way or the other. Of course, that leads to the possibility of escalation, even to the nuclear level. So I don't mean to be at all complacent about it. And another thing was about the old Cold War was that the Soviet Union was never really a technological or economic competitor of the United States, though we didn't know that at the time. I remember during the Cold War, and Hank will remember, we were very much afraid of the Soviet technology, the missile gap, and so on and so forth. But it turns out that they and we had no either economic interdependence with them, with the Soviets or their bloc. But what is the same about the Cold War is simply that it is the defining confrontation or competition of the age. I don't know how long the age will last, but certainly looks like it's going to set in for some decades at least, in which it's an all points competition, diplomatic, economic, technological, and military deterrence in place. And China is our leading rival, our pacing challenge, as the Pentagon puts it, and they are the main worry for the United States, and vice versa. The United States has always been, not always, I shouldn't say, but since the since the end of the Sino-Soviet confrontation in 1989, so since 1989, the Chinese have consistently viewed the US as their main threat. So this is the dominant axis, despite the war in Ukraine, of international political tension for the coming some number of decades, I would think at least.
It's funny, Andy, when you mentioned that when we were young, that people all thought the Soviet Union was going to be this huge power. I have this great memory of being in Leningrad in the early 1980s, and I was at the U.S. consulate where, as you know, American consulates and embassies have Marine Guards. And the poor guys who were the Marine Guards of the Leningrad consulate, God knows what they did with their lives. I mean, they pumped iron a lot, but one of the guys there in the Marine Guards was I guess you'd have to call him an extreme Reaganite at the time's early 80s, and was regaling us graduate students with how dangerous the Soviet Union was, and we had to stop them before because they were so powerful, etc. And I remember one of my colleagues looked at him and said, "Wait a second, have you seen the number 46 bus, which is a bus that would take you from where our dorms were there, and it was this articulated bus that was belching smoke all the time. The front half of the bus was tilted one way, this other half was tilted the other way. It was checkmate and already falling apart." It was, and of course the image, if you spent any time in the Soviet Union at that time, was of a country that had clearly made great progress from the past, but had quite a ways to go. It was not very modern or anything in many important respects. Whereas I haven't been to China, of course, for many decades, but any images you see of China now is of an extremely modern society, one that actually makes America look a little bit more like the Soviet Union I knew, where we have aging infrastructure and things like that. But
yeah, welcome to the New York City subway system.
And do we have any more questions?
No, that's all of the questions from the attendees.
So, Andy, do you have any? I have no further questions, and I guess we can end if we wish, or continue the conversation. Do you have any other points, Andy, that you want to make? I'm sort of run out of particular questions to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, I do want to ask one question. Let me ask you something, because we mentioned Hong Kong before.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about the situation in Hong Kong. How bad has it become, particularly from the vantage point of student movements and faculty and et cetera, but in general?
Yeah, it's bad. It's very, very bad. Student movement is completely suppressed. All the leaders of the pro-democracy camp are either in exile or in prison. The judicial system, under the national security law, the judicial system is absolutely biased under the control. The national security law created an extraordinary sort of layered system of control. It defined 4 vague laws, 4 vague crimes. being against the system, criticizing, I don't remember the exact crimes, but basically anything disloyal to the mainland government and collusion with outside forces would be a crime. And then they created a special branch of the police who were the loyalists of the police to prosecute these crimes, a special branch of the courts to prosecute these crimes. Those two branches were supervised by a committee inside of the chief executive's administration. The chief executive is somebody selected by Beijing as a loyalist. And then they sent a delegate from Beijing who would sit in on the meetings of that supervisory committee to make sure that they were doing the right thing. And then they added a provision for the mainland to extradite at its own decision anybody in the very unlikely case that the Hong Kong legal system didn't sufficiently prosecute anybody that Beijing didn't like. They added a provision that we could take that person and try him or her on mainland courts. And then they arrested so many people, student leaders, media leaders like Jimmy Lai, professors, anybody who had been a leader against them, and put them in jail without bail. So they haven't even been tried in most cases in the space of, what is it now, 3 years? 2 or 3, I forget. And they're sitting in jail, and they're going to be convicted, and they're going to be handed long sentences. And it's just horribly, well, it completely has demoralized anybody who's not in prison in Hong Kong. So that situation is bad, and nobody can do anything about it. We cannot. The US government, the British government, which has an interest under international law, under the US, the China-Britain joint declaration, Britain has a legal interest in what goes on in Hong Kong and in Beijing, honoring its commitment for one country, two systems. But Britain can do, nobody can do anything about that.
Well, on that cheerful note,
Yeah,
we're running out of time. I want to hand things back over to Jim Turk for concluding remarks and about future programs. But I do want to, before I let Jim speak, I want to thank Andy. I would thank Meg. I'll do it by email when she's on, for a really interesting conversation. I learned a lot today, and I want to thank Jim and the center for setting this up, and their staff, Ange and Luke, for helping. It's been a great panel, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope our audience has too. Jim?
Well, thank you so much. I want to join you in thanking Andy and Meg. And I also want to thank you, Hank. You did a wonderful job pulling this together. And a video recording of this will be put on the CFE website tomorrow, so that others who weren't able to listen live will be able to hear it. In fact, our largest audience typically are people who listen to the video. We also post on the website, so to let everyone in the audience know, we post on the website resources for people who've listened to the panel and would like to read more about this, learn more about this. There'll be a list of articles and YouTube videos or whatever that will be posted along with the video. As well, I'd like to just share a little bit about our next event. It will be on Tuesday, May 16th, so 2 weeks from yesterday. And it'll be a very different topic. It'll be, the title is Confronting the New Wave of Anti-Semitism. It'll feature Philip Slayton, who's the author of a new book with the same title. He's an award-winning writer, a lawyer, former dean of law at McGill University, as well as past president of Penn Canada. And he'll be in conversation with Samir Gandesha, who's the director of the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University. So that'll be Tuesday, May 16th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Videos of all our past events, the one in India, the one in Israel and Palestine, and all the others, are available on our website. Again, the website address is CFE for Center for Free Expression, cfe.torontomu.ca. So thank you to the audience for joining us. And again, a very large and warm thank you to you, Hank, and to Andy and to Meg for having such an engaging discussion today. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.